The wind was biting that morning, howling through the narrow, ice-encrusted streets of the village and pushing Mark's scarf tighter against his face. His footsteps crunched across the fresh layer of snow covering the lake's frozen surface as he walked toward the far side of the village. This winter, like every other in his life, had wrapped the small settlement in a chilling grip. Mark had grown accustomed to these conditions since he was a boy, so the ice-covered lake wasn't anything unusual to him. Tall pines lined the shoreline, their branches weighted down by clumps of snow. Beyond them lay the icebound lake, stretching outward like a frozen plain. Mark needed to fix a fishing net at the other end of the village. Fishing through the lake's icy crust was a necessity in these harsh winters. As he trudged along, his eyes scanned the whiteness around him. Here, the landscape was so quiet that the occasional cracks and groans of the ice shifting below startled him. The sun hung low, casting a pale orange hue across the snow, illuminating the white expanse in a soft, ethereal glow. Something glimmered out of place, catching Mark's eye. A few dozen yards ahead, the ice surface seemed to dip subtly, and a peculiar bubble of air had formed beneath it. He squinted to get a better look, setting down his net and stepping cautiously toward the strange formation. As he reached the spot, he peered down through the thin layer of ice, noticing something unusual. The air pocket was large and contained within what seemed to be a dark tunnel. Light refracted through the ice, creating twisting shadows, while the low groans from the lake's depths added to the eerie atmosphere. The tunnel-like cavity beneath seemed to lead down into the darkness, winding further under the frozen lake. The sight reminded him of the whispers from the elders in the village, a story about the lake's ice covering something mysterious. But he had always dismissed it as superstition. He never imagined that such a bizarre structure could exist here, right beneath their feet. Despite the unsettling nature of the air pocket, his curiosity flared up, pushing aside any apprehension he felt. He knelt down and ran his gloved fingers along the ice, feeling the cold seeping through. The way the bubble swirled and refracted light gave him a strange feeling, like he was gazing into another world. An inexplicable urge tugged at him to investigate further, to uncover the secrets buried below. The errand was quickly forgotten. Instead, he stood up and brushed snowflakes off his coat. The chilly wind nipped at his cheeks as he surveyed the area again, mentally noting the way back to this spot. He realized he would need proper gear to explore this phenomenon, and he knew it would be a perilous task. As he turned to head back toward the village, he glanced back at the air pocket and the stark emptiness around it, the bubble of air resting quietly beneath the ice. With a shiver running down his spine, he picked up his net and quickened his pace. All the way back, his thoughts were consumed by the air pocket and what lay beneath the lake's icy grip. Inside his modest cabin, Mark layered his winter gear methodically. Each item was carefully chosen: wool socks, thick gloves, a thermal undershirt, and a sturdy parka. He set out a sturdy backpack on the dining table and began stuffing it with supplies: a thick coil of rope, a flashlight, extra batteries, dried rations, a flask of water, and his trusty ice axe. Each item made a distinct clink as he packed it away, the sound echoing in the quiet room. He zipped up the bag, feeling a chill as he recalled the mysterious air pocket he had seen beneath the ice. He slipped into his boots, strapped on his snowshoes, and grabbed his walking stick. The weight of the bag felt reassuring, yet he couldn't escape the uneasy feeling that sat in the pit of his stomach. Stepping out into the biting cold, he made his way back to the lake, the snow crunching underfoot. He kept his eyes forward, focused on the frozen landscape ahead, while his breath puffed out in visible white clouds. Each step brought him closer to that curious air pocket, and with each crunch of snow he felt more determined. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, painting the snow in deep pinks and purples, creating an almost otherworldly scene. As he approached the spot, Mark carefully examined the ice with his walking stick, testing its strength before kneeling and brushing the fresh layer of snow aside. Beneath, the air pocket remained, an undisturbed tunnel winding down into the dark depths. He unsheathed his ice axe and began chipping away. steadily carving out an opening large enough for him to slip through. The wind howled across the lake, rattling the trees on the shore. The last vestiges of daylight quickly faded, leaving only the dim light of twilight reflecting off the snow. Finally, he broke through the ice, revealing the dark tunnel below. He secured his rope to a nearby pine tree, tested the knot, and lowered himself cautiously into the hole. The tunnel walls were slick with frost, and Mark descended carefully, using the rope to steady himself as he navigated the winding path. The ice creaked and groaned around him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was an intruder in an ancient place. His breath fogged up his visor, and the flashlight's beam cut through the cold mist. After several meters, the tunnel opened into a cavernous space. Mark's breath caught as he saw the ice walls glisten in the dim light, giving the illusion of being surrounded by thousands of tiny, frozen stars, illuminating the frozen forms of trees and stone structures embedded in the ice. He stepped forward cautiously, his flashlight scanning the faint outlines of buildings buried in layers of frost. The silence in the cavern was profound, interrupted only by the occasional drip of melting ice echoing off the walls. Mark approached the nearest structure, which resembled a small, crude house half buried in ice. Its door was shut, but peering through a frosted window, he could just make out a dark interior. He couldn't help but shiver, not from the cold, but from the eerie feeling that washed over him. He moved slowly through the cavern, shining his light over various shapes and frozen forms, all preserved in a glacial graveyard. The wind from above funneled through the tunnel, creating a ghostly wail that seemed to emanate from the very walls around him. He approached a larger structure near the center of the cavern. It had the appearance of a small chapel, but the roof had partially collapsed under the weight of the ice. As he neared, Mark noticed a faint creaking sound, like wood strained by the cold. The chapel door hung ajar, revealing a faintly lit passage. Mark pushed the door further open with a creak, revealing an aisle flanked by wooden pews, all half buried in layers of frost. He moved cautiously forward, each step reverberating in the cavernous silence. His flashlight's beam sliced through the cold mist, illuminating a large stone altar at the far end, draped in a blanket of icy crystals. Above, the vaulted ceiling arched like the ribcage of a long-dead leviathan, casting shadows that flickered as his light danced across the chapel walls. Mark's gaze was drawn to the ice-covered figures seated in the pews. Frozen in their last moments, they sat motionless, some with their heads bowed in prayer, others with arms outstretched, faces twisted in expressions of despair or defiance. The sight sent a chill down Mark's spine, and he wondered what kind of calamity had befallen these people. He approached the altar, where a large book rested, its pages fused together by the frost. A golden chalice lay beside it, partially encased in ice. With gloved fingers, he reached for the book, and a layer of brittle ice cracked off as he lifted the cover. The pages inside had grown thin and translucent, and he could barely make out the faded writing. He flipped through carefully, catching glimpses of sermons and sacred texts, prayers and lamentations. On the final page, he saw an ominous passage written in bold, spidery letters. The ink had bled, making the words almost unreadable, but Mark could discern a warning. In the shadow of the ice, may we be preserved from the one who walks beneath. He closed the book and glanced up at the stone crucifix mounted above the altar. Frost had crept over the surface, and long icicles hung down like frozen tears. The whole chapel seemed to echo with a sense of desolation, and Mark felt like an intruder in a place that wasn't meant to be found. He turned away from the altar and made his way back down the aisle, stepping past the frozen congregation and out into the cavern. The chill felt deeper now, pressing in on him like a suffocating blanket. He glanced around, noticing other structures emerging from the ice, a blacksmith's forge, a marketplace, and small cottages clustered together like a forgotten village. The entire settlement lay preserved in an eternal winter, each building filled with remnants of a life abandoned in haste. He explored further, stepping into a larger building that appeared to be a tavern. Inside, Tables were set with plates and cups, all covered in a layer of icy dust. Frozen figures were seated at the tables, their faces locked in expressions of surprise, fear, and sorrow. Mark found himself lingering near a hearth that had long gone cold, imagining the warmth it once brought to this place. A sharp sound interrupted his thoughts, the faint scraping of ice against stone. He swung his flashlight toward the doorway, but found nothing there. The silence settled in again, but a sense of unease hung thick in the air. The cold seemed to intensify, and he noticed his breath crystallizing faster. Mark stepped back outside into the cavern, scanning the shadows. He heard it again. A scraping noise, like fingernails clawing at frozen wood. It came from deeper within the cavern. He moved forward slowly, each step crunching on the ice, the light from his flashlight trembling as he held it out ahead of him. Ahead, he saw a dimly lit alleyway between two cottages. He stepped into the narrow space, the walls of ice pressing in on both sides. The scraping noise grew louder. Mark followed it to a small clearing beyond, where a large fissure split the ice like an open wound. The opening was wide enough to slip through, revealing another network of tunnels twisting deeper into the darkness. A low murmur seemed to emanate from below, growing louder until it was a chorus of whispers, their words tangled and indiscernible. He could make out a faint light at the end of one of the tunnels, flickering like a ghostly beacon. His heart pounded as he descended further, the icy walls pressing closer. The whispers swelled until they were deafening, echoing off the cavern walls like an eerie chant. The tunnel opened up into another cavern, larger and more expansive than the last. Mark stepped forward cautiously, and his flashlight illuminated a vast chamber filled with frozen forms. Here, preserved for generations, lay an entire village, with buildings, tools, and even livestock encased in the ice. Frozen villagers lined the streets, and in the center of the square stood an enormous statue carved from black stone. The statue depicted a figure draped in flowing robes, its face obscured by a hood, one hand outstretched as if beckoning. Mark approached the statue carefully, feeling the whispers circling around him like a vortex. The air grew thick, and a strange pressure filled his ears. He examined the base of the statue, which bore an inscription. "In the presence of the One, we shall endure." The words were etched deep, as though gouged by desperate hands. The whispers grew into a frenzied, echoing chant as Mark backed away from the statue, the swirling sounds drilling into his skull. He felt the freezing air constrict his lungs and tightened his grip on the flashlight. He spun around and pointed the beam into the darkness, frantically searching for the escape route. His eyes darted across the glacial walls, barely making out the entrance tunnel in the far corner of the cavern. Mark broke into a sprint, his boots slipping on the icy ground as he dashed past the frozen forms of villagers. He glanced back at the statue looming in the center of the square, its stone hand outstretched in a silent command. The whispers trailed behind him like a spectral wind, rustling through the cavern with an eerie rhythm that set his teeth on edge. He picked up speed as he neared the tunnel entrance. The low murmurs twisted into guttural growls as if the ice itself had awakened. Shadows flickered at the edges of the tunnel, and Mark felt the pressure mounting around him, pressing into his ears until it was unbearable. His breath grew shallow, his pulse pounding in his chest like a drum. Every heartbeat echoed off the tunnel walls as he scrambled up the narrow passage, the ice cracking beneath his feet. The air grew colder, and the darkness closed in around him. He could feel the ancient presence lurking just out of sight, its breath prickling the back of his neck. The flashlight beam bobbed erratically as he ran, illuminating jagged patches of ice that shimmered like shattered glass. The whispers swelled to a fever pitch, their chant reaching a cacophony that reverberated through the tunnel like a twisted hymn. Mark stumbled as the ice gave way beneath him, and he nearly lost his footing. He lunged forward, clawing at the slick walls for balance. The flashlight slipped from his grip, clattering to the ground and plunging the tunnel into darkness. His hands groped through the freezing gloom until he found the flashlight again, and he flicked it back on with trembling fingers. The beam revealed the tunnel stretching upward, and he pushed forward with renewed determination. The air was thick with frost, and the temperature plummeted with every step. Mark felt his lungs burning as he ascended, his breath turning to ice against his visor. The tunnel twisted and curved, but he finally saw a glimmer of pale light ahead, the hole he had carved in the frozen lake. He scrambled up the last few meters, his boots slipping on the jagged ice. He reached the surface and hauled himself out of the tunnel, collapsing onto the frozen lake as the wind whipped across the snow. He lay there, gasping, his breath fogging in the air as he looked back at the dark entrance. The whispers still echoed faintly in his ears, but the wind quickly drowned them out. He yanked the rope free and staggered to his feet, his heartbeat still racing as he stumbled toward the shore. The cold bit into his exposed skin, and he could feel frost nipping at his fingers through his gloves. He took one last glance at the tunnel, now silent and sealed beneath the ice, before turning away and trudging back to the village. The eerie silence of the night settled around the village as Mark trudged back to his cabin, every muscle aching from the frantic escape. He bolted the door shut and layered his frost-covered clothes across the chair by the fireplace, his breath slowly returning to normal. He turned up the lamp's wick, and the warm light pooled in the cabin, casting long shadows across the walls. But even with the warmth and light, the sense of dread clung to him. The whispers he had heard in the cavern still echoed in his mind. The image of that ancient statue with its hand outstretched kept flashing before his eyes. He knew he had ventured too far into forbidden territory. The minutes ticked by, and fatigue began to pull at his eyelids. But Mark couldn't bring himself to sleep. Each gust of wind outside made him flinch, and he kept glancing at the door, expecting to see something lurking there. He paced the room, replaying the escape in his head. Just when he thought he had finally calmed down, a soft, rhythmic sound reached his ears. It was a low hum, almost imperceptible but unmistakably present. Mark froze in place, straining to listen. The sound was faint but persistent, like a murmur drifting up from the depths of the lake. The cold, icy grip of terror began to creep up his spine again. His gaze swept toward the window, and he hesitated before inching closer. The shutters rattled as the wind howled outside, but he could make out no movement beyond the frosted panes. He reached for the latch with trembling fingers and peeked through a narrow gap. The snow-covered village appeared empty, the moonlight casting long shadows across the buildings. But as Mark squinted into the gloom, he saw something moving between the trees on the lakeshore. A dark silhouette, its cloak fluttering in the wind as it glided forward with an unsettling grace. Mark snapped the shutter closed and stumbled back, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. The whispers rose again, curling around his mind like icy tendrils. He could hear them growing louder, the murmurs growing into a maddening chant that seemed to shake the very walls of the cabin. He snatched up his coat and hat, threw open the back door, and bolted into the night. The cold air whipped against his face as he sprinted across the snow, his boots sinking deep with every step. He cast a glance over his shoulder and saw the figure emerging from the shadows, gliding silently across the snow like a wraith. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the pines, and Mark felt the presence drawing closer, the shadow expanding around him. He reached the edge of the forest and stumbled into the trees, ducking under low-hanging branches and pushing through thickets as he tried to put as much distance as possible between himself and the entity. He ran until his lungs burned, his legs buckling beneath him. But he didn't dare slow down. He could hear the faint scraping of ice against stone, like fingernails clawing at a frozen wall. The whispers twisted through the air, growing more frantic. Mark finally broke through the tree line and reached a small clearing. The wind had picked up, swirling snowflakes around in shimmering arcs. He looked back and saw nothing but the shadows between the trees, but he knew the presence was still there, waiting in the darkness. Gasping for breath, Mark knelt down and scooped up a handful of snow, pressing it against his face. He squeezed his eyes shut and whispered a prayer to whatever gods might be listening. The wind howled around him, and the whispers faded into the distance. He opened his eyes and found himself alone in the clearing. His breath fogged in the air as he listened. But all he could hear was the rustling of the trees, The whispers had finally fallen silent. Mark stood up, shivering as he glanced back at the village. The ancient deity that lay beneath the ice had let him escape, but he couldn't be sure for how long. He would keep the secret of the frozen cavern buried deep, vowing never to return or disturb the darkness that lingered below. The entity would remain undisturbed as long as Mark never spoke a word. And he swore to keep it that way.